Your husband is here with a woman who looks exactly like you." Those 11 words detonated Angie McNeil's reality at 3:14 p.m. on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. She was standing in the glass-walled conference room of First Meridian Financial, reviewing quarterly trust distributions when her phone vibrated against the polished oak table. The number was local but unfamiliar. The voice on the other end carried the careful neutrality of someone trained to deliver impossible news. "Mrs. McNeil, this is David Cho from the Premier Branch on Lakeshore. I apologize for the interruption, but we have a rather urgent situation developing. Your husband, Brian McNeil, is currently in our private banking suite with a woman carrying state identification in your name. She's presenting as you, ma'am. And I have to be honest, the physical resemblance is significant enough that it's created some confusion among our staff." The documents in Angie's hands didn't fall. Her face didn't crumble. But something fundamental shifted behind her eyes, a recalibration so complete that the world beyond the glass walls seemed to blur into watercolor irrelevance. What came next would expose a conspiracy so intimate, so surgically precise, that it required someone who didn't just know Angie McNeil, but someone who'd studied her like prey. Let's return to the moment everything Angie thought she understood became a lie. Before we begin, click subscribe button, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. The trust fund spreadsheets remained steady in Angie's grip even as her pulse turned to thunder. Around her, portfolio managers and estate attorneys continued their conversations about asset allocation and dividend yields, completely unaware that her marriage was currently attempting to delete her from existence. She rose from her seat with the deliberate grace that came from years of being the only black woman in rooms that didn't expect her, her red dress a silent declaration as she moved toward the windows overlooking the water. "David," Angie said, her voice carrying the same composed authority she used to close multi-million-dollar portfolio transfers, "I need you to describe this woman with specificity." She heard the rustle of someone checking notes, the muffled sound of a door closing. "She's your approximate height, Mrs. McNeil. I'd say 5'7" or 5'8". Similar skin tone, similar build. Her hair is styled in a natural updo, very polished, professional. She's wearing business casual, navy slacks and a white blouse, carrying a designer handbag, looks expensive. And Mrs. McNeil, I'm telling you this because you need to understand the severity. If I'd passed her in a hallway, I wouldn't have questioned it was you." Angie's mind began constructing timelines, possibilities, calculating how many hours of observation this would have required. What accounts is my husband attempting to access? There was a pause that felt like falling. "Your personal trust fund, Mrs. McNeil. The one established from your grandmother's estate. He's also requesting access to the joint investment account, your life insurance policy cash value, and the real estate holding account. They're presenting withdrawal authorizations for complete liquidation with wire transfer requests. Mrs. McNeil, the paperwork looks legitimate. Notarized signatures, proper forms, everything processed correctly. But our protocol for transactions exceeding 10 million requires voice verification from both account holders, which is the only reason I'm calling you now." 10 million. The number sat in the air like a blade. That wasn't just money. That was 3 generations of her family's survival, her grandmother's sacrifice, her mother's careful stewardship. That was her daughter's futures, her independence, her name. "David, I need you to understand something with absolute clarity," Angie said, and the warmth had evaporated from her voice entirely, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "I am currently standing in First Meridian Financial's downtown office. I have signed no authorization forms. I have requested no liquidations. I am not at your branch. That woman is not me, and whatever my husband is executing constitutes fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. I need you to delay them without indicating you've made contact with me. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am, David said, and she could hear him straightening in his chair. I'll inform them we're experiencing delays with our verification system due to new federal banking compliance updates. That should give you approximately 30 to 40 minutes before they suspect anything. Make it 50, Angie said. Tell them the fraud prevention team needs to run enhanced verification protocols on transactions over 7 figures. Use whatever terminology sounds institutional and bureaucratic. Understood, Mrs. McNeil. And ma'am, I'm sorry you're going through this. The line went silent. Angie stood motionless for exactly 7 seconds, her reflection suspended in the floor-to-ceiling glass. A woman in a red dress that cost what some people earned in a month. A woman who'd built a career managing other people's legacies while protecting her own. A woman who'd trusted the wrong person with her entire life. She turned back toward the conference table where her team waited. Her senior advisor, Marcus Chen, caught the change in her expression immediately and excused himself from the discussion. Angie, what's wrong? Marcus had been managing high-net-worth portfolios for 15 years. He'd seen clients navigate divorces, bankruptcies, and family warfare over estates. But he'd never seen Angie's face look like this. I need you to finalize the trust distributions exactly as planned, she said quietly. Sign what needs signing. I have a personal emergency. His expression shifted to concern. What kind of emergency? The kind where my husband is currently at a bank with a woman impersonating me, attempting to liquidate $10 million from accounts that have my name on them.
Marcus's mouth opened, then closed. He nodded once, his jaw tightening with understanding.
Go.
I'll handle everything here. What do you need? I need evidence, Angie said, already moving toward the door. And I need them to believe they're succeeding until the exact moment I make them disappear. She was walking now, her heels striking the marble with mechanical precision, her mind shifting into the analytical clarity that made her one of the most trusted wealth advisors in the city. The elevator ride down felt both instantaneous and suspended in amber. Her phone was already in her hand, scrolling through contacts until she found the name she needed. McNeil Residence, came the voice of Patricia, the woman who'd managed their home for the past 6 years. Patricia, it's Angie. I need you to tell me exactly what time Brian left the house today, whether anyone was with him, and if you've noticed anything missing from my office. Patricia's voice carried the same measured efficiency it always did. Mr. McNeil left at approximately 10:30 this morning, Mrs. McNeil. He mentioned meeting with a contractor about the lake house renovation. He was alone. Alone. The word landed with surgical precision. Angie's heels struck the parking garage concrete as she moved toward her car, her mind already reconstructing the timeline. 4.5 hours. Enough time to drive across town, enough time to coordinate, enough time for a woman who'd spent weeks becoming her to perfect the final performance. Has anyone else been to the house recently? Anyone Brian brought by that you didn't recognize? Not that I've seen, ma'am. Though Mr. McNeil has been spending more time in your home office lately. Said he was learning about the investment accounts, wanted to understand your portfolio strategy better. The memory surfaced unbidden. Brian at her desk 3 weeks ago, his laptop open beside her financial files, wearing that boyish smile that used to make her feel generous instead of exposed. I want to understand your world better, You've built something incredible. Teach me. She'd thought it was growth. Men in their social circle didn't usually show interest in their wives' professional expertise, didn't ask questions about trust structures and beneficiary designations with genuine curiosity. She'd interpreted his attention as evolution, as partnership finally becoming equal after 8 years of marriage. God, she'd been performing mental gymnastics to justify red flags the size of billboards. The car door closed with a soft thunk. Angie sat motionless in the driver's seat, her hands resting on the wheel, her reflection staring back from the rearview mirror. When had Brian started asking about her life insurance cash value? 6 months ago, maybe 7. Casual questions dropped into dinner conversations like they meant nothing. If something happened to you, how would I access the funds? Just want to make sure I could take care of the girls. She'd added him as a beneficiary the next week. Rational decision. Logical protection. The kind of thing responsible spouses did. And the joint accounts, those had been her idea too. We're married, Brian. What's mine is ours. She'd said it with such confidence, such belief that love and logic could coexist in perfect harmony. She'd built her career on calculating risk, on reading people's financial behavior like hieroglyphics. But she'd never thought to audit her own husband. The truth assembled itself with clinical clarity. Brian knew she had trust meetings every Thursday at 3 p.m., knew her phone would be on silent in that glass-walled conference room. Knew Marcus would be there, knew she'd be unreachable for at least 45 minutes. He'd engineered the perfect window. But this kind of precision, finding someone who could impersonate her, forging documents that passed professional scrutiny, timing it down to the hour. This wasn't just Brian's ambition. Angie's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, her pulse steady despite the realization spreading through her chest like ice water. Someone had helped him. Someone who knew her almost as well as he did. And she was about to find out exactly who. Inside the premier branch on Lakeshore, Lynn Lowe sat with her hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced to stop them from trembling. The private banking suite smelled like leather and money, all dark wood paneling and abstract art that probably cost more than her annual salary. Brian sat beside her, his posture relaxed, confident, his hand occasionally brushing her knee in what the bank staff might interpret as affection but Lynn recognized as control. You know what to do, he'd said in the car. You've practiced this. You are her. She'd rehearsed the walk, measured, purposeful, heels striking with authority. She'd practiced the voice, lower register, careful enunciation, the slight upward lilt at the end of questions. She'd studied videos, photographs, the way Angie McNeil held a pen, the way she tilted her head when listening. 3 months of becoming someone else, and now David Cho was explaining system delays with a kind of apologetic professionalism that made Lynn's stomach twist with suspicion. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, in the way the assistant manager kept glancing toward the back offices, in the extended hold times that shouldn't exist for clients with this much money. Mrs. McNeil, David said, returning with another form. I just need to verify a few personal details for our fraud prevention protocols. Standard procedure for transactions of this magnitude. Lynn's rehearsed smile held steady. Of course. Can you confirm your mother's maiden name? Richardson. The answer came immediately. She'd memorized everything. And the city where you and Mr. McNeil first met? Brian's hand tightened on her knee. Lynn felt her breath catch for just a fraction of a second. They discussed this. She knew this. Chicago, she said, but something in her voice wavered, uncertain. 2 miles away, Angie's car idled at a red light, her phone pressed to her ear. She'd called David back, requesting details under the pretense of providing additional verification assistance. How does she move? Angie asked, her voice clinical, detached. When she walks, does she lead with her shoulders or her hips? David hesitated, clearly confused by the specificity. Her hips, I think. She walks like she's very conscious of being watched. Wrong. Angie led with her shoulders, always had. Years of carrying the weight of other people's expectations made you move differently. This woman was performing femininity, not embodying it. And when she speaks, does she make eye contact or look away when answering questions? She looks away, Mrs. McNeil. Briefly, but consistently. Angie's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, her mind constructing a profile. Coached but not confident. Trained but not natural. Someone who needed this money badly enough to commit federal crimes but couldn't quite erase her own tells. Someone vulnerable. Someone Brian could manipulate. The woman's name, Angie said quietly. Did she sign anything yet? The initial authorization form, yes. The signature looked legitimate, but the name on her ID is Lynn Lowe. She's presenting it as a legal name, claiming you use your maiden name professionally. Lynn Lowe. Angie committed it to memory, her thumb already opening her phone's browser, typing the name with mechanical precision. The search results loaded. Angie's breath stopped. Lynn Lowe, former actress. Bankruptcy filing 18 months ago. And 3 years before that, a restraining order against her ex-husband for financial coercion. Brian hadn't chosen randomly. He'd found someone who'd already learned how to disappear into someone else's life just to survive. Someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be erased. Angie sat in her car outside the house she'd shared with Brian for 8 years, her laptop balanced on the steering wheel, reconstructing the architecture of her own destruction. The forged signatures would have required practice. Months of it. Brian had access to her files, her contracts, every document she'd ever signed. He could have traced them, studied the pressure points, the way her capital A curved slightly left, the way she dotted her I's with precision. With enough time and motivation, signatures became replicable, especially when paired with someone like Lynn, an actress trained to mimic, to embody, to disappear into character. The duplicate ID would have been more complex. State-issued identification meant database access, professional forgery, or possibly corruption. Someone at the DMV, someone willing to process fraudulent documentation for the right price. That thread alone could unravel into conspiracy charges. And the notarized documents, that was the piece that made Angie's blood run cold. Notarization required a licensed professional, someone who'd verified identity in person, someone who'd stamped their credentials onto criminal fraud. Either Brian had found a corrupt notary, or Lynn had been convincing enough to fool a legitimate one. Either scenario meant this plan had been executed with meticulous, surgical precision. Federal banking protocols existed for exactly this reason. Transactions exceeding certain thresholds triggered enhanced verification processes, voice confirmation, secondary identification, automated fraud detection systems. But Brian had studied those protocols too. He'd timed this for a moment when Angie would be unreachable, when her phone would be on silent, when 45 minutes of delay would feel routine rather than suspicious. If David Cho hadn't followed procedure, if he'd processed those wire transfers based on documentation alone, Angie would have discovered the theft hours later. Maybe days. By then, Brian and Lynn would have vanished into whatever life they'd constructed from the ashes of hers. This wasn't infidelity. Infidelity was human, messy, emotional. This was premeditated erasure. This was financial murder. Angie closed her laptop and walked into her house with the kind of calm that precedes violence. Patricia had already left for the day. The silence felt deliberate, staged, like walking onto a set after everyone else had gone home. Brian's office first, then hers. The filing cabinet in her home office sat slightly ajar, folders askew in a way that looked casual but wasn't. Angie's insurance documents missing. The trust amendment paperwork she'd prepared last month gone. Photocopies, probably. Everything Brian needed to establish beneficiary claims, to prove access rights, to demonstrate joint ownership. Her phone was already dialing before she'd fully processed the implications. Mitchell, it's Angie McNeil. I need you to listen very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. My husband is currently attempting to liquidate $10 million from accounts bearing my name using a woman impersonating me with forged documentation. I need an emergency injunction, I need account freezes, and I need criminal referrals filed within the hour. Mitchell Graham had been her family's attorney for 15 years. His pause lasted exactly 2 seconds. I'll have everything ready in 30 minutes. Angie, where are you going? To the bank, she said, already moving toward her bedroom. I'm going to watch him realize he's not as smart as he thinks he is. She stood before her closet, her reflection multiplied in the mirror. The red dress came off. What replaced it was deliberate. Black suit, structured shoulders, heels sharp enough to draw blood. Not fashion. Armor. The premier branch on Lakeshore had marble floors that announced arrival like a drumbeat. Angie McNeil's heels struck each tile with metronomic precision, the sound cutting through the hushed reverence of wealth management and private banking. She moved through the lobby with the kind of presence that made conversations pause mid-sentence, made heads turn without anyone quite understanding why. The black suit fit like intention. Her posture carried 3 generations of women who'd refused to disappear. David Cho saw her first. His face shifted from confusion to comprehension to something approaching relief. He stepped forward, but Angie raised one hand. Not now, and continued toward the private banking suite where glass walls revealed everything. Brian sat in a leather chair, his posture relaxed, his arm draped casually across the back of Lynn Lowe's seat. He was mid-sentence, saying something that made the assistant manager nod politely when his peripheral vision caught movement. He turned and froze. The color didn't drain from his face all at once. It happened in stages: recognition, disbelief, calculation, then something close to panic bleeding through the careful mask he'd worn for 8 years. Beside him, Lynn Lowe's hands went to her lap, fingers twisting together, her rehearsed confidence crumbling like wet paper. Angie opened the door. The sound was soft, controlled. She stepped inside, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I believe," Angie said, her voice carrying the same measured calm she used to explain portfolio strategies to anxious clients, "you're sitting in my seat." Lynn stood immediately, instinctively, her body recognizing authority even when her mind was still catching up. Brian remained frozen, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for words in a language he'd forgotten. David Cho entered behind Angie, another bank officer following with a tablet displaying split-screen surveillance footage. On one side, Lynn Lowe entering the bank at 2:47 p.m. On the other, Angie McNeil entering First Meridian Financial at 2:43 p.m., for miles away, time-stamped and irrefutable. "Mr. McNeil," David said, his professional courtesy now edged with something harder, "I'm going to need you and Ms. Lowe to remain seated while we contact the authorities." "This is a misunderstanding," Brian said, but his voice had lost its resonance, had become thin and desperate. He looked at Angie, trying to find the woman who'd trusted him, who'd added his name to accounts, who'd believed in partnership. I can explain." "No," Angie said, and the single word landed like a gavel. "You really can't." She turned to David, her movements deliberate. "I want copies of every document they presented. I want the surveillance footage preserved. I want a full audit of every account they attempted to access." She paused, letting the silence build. "And I want to know exactly when they plan to disappear." Lynn was crying now, silent tears tracking mascara down her cheeks. Brian's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white, his jaw working like he was trying to chew through his own denial. "You don't understand," Brian said, and his voice cracked on the last word. You needed what was mine," Angie said. "And you were willing to erase me to get it." She watched something shift behind his eyes. Not remorse, not guilt, but fear. Raw, animal fear of consequences he'd never actually believed would materialize. He'd thought she was manageable, predictable, trusting. He'd been catastrophically wrong. For the first time in their marriage, Brian McNeil looked at his wife and understood. She'd always been the dangerous one. The private banking suite had transformed into an interrogation room without anyone changing the furniture. 2 police officers stood by the door. David Cho had retreated to a corner with his tablet, documenting everything. And Angie sat across from Brian and Lynn with the stillness of someone watching a play they'd already seen the ending to. Lynn broke first. "It took 11 minutes. He said it was temporary," she whispered, her voice fractured, hands twisting a tissue into ribbons. "He said you were having financial disputes, that you'd frozen him out of accounts that were rightfully his. He said he just needed access for a few weeks until your lawyers sorted everything out." She looked up at Angie, desperate for something: understanding, mercy, absolution. "I lost everything in my divorce. My ex-husband cleared out our accounts, left me with debt I didn't know existed. When Brian found me, I was 2 months from eviction. He offered me $20,000 to help him with what he called a banking misunderstanding." "20,000," Angie repeated, her voice empty of inflection. "He was planning to take $10 million, and he bought you for $20,000. Lynn's face crumpled. I studied you. For 3 months. Videos, photos, the way you signed documents, the way you walked. He had recordings of your voice, files from your office. I practiced in front of mirrors until I could. Her voice broke. I didn't want to be someone who does this. But I didn't know how else to survive. Angie's gaze shifted to Brian. He sat rigid, his lawyer's composure fighting against the reality that no argument would rebuild what had collapsed. You want to tell me it was temporary, too? It was a loan, Brian said, and even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded. I was going to return it. I have investments that are about to mature, opportunities that required capital. You'd never have noticed the money was gone. $10 million. Angie's tone didn't rise. Didn't need to. From accounts bearing my grandmother's name. Money that represented 3 generations of survival. And you thought I would notice. You have more than you need, Brian snapped, his mask finally fracturing. You've always had more. Your trust fund, your inheritance, your portfolio. I've spent 8 years living in your financial shadow, being the man who married into wealth instead of earning it. This was supposed to be yours, Angie finished. You were erasing me to claim what you thought you deserved. The detective standing nearest pulled out a document from the folder David had provided. Mrs. McNeil, were you aware that your life insurance beneficiary designation was changed 4 months ago? The temperature in the room dropped another degree. Changed to whom? Angie asked, though some part of her already knew. To your husband. Sole beneficiary. The previous designation listed your daughters as primary, your mother as secondary. The detective's expression was carefully neutral. There's also evidence Mr. McNeil researched sudden death clauses, accidental death provisions, and payout timelines. Brian's face went white. That's not. I was just. But Angie wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was reconstructing a different timeline, one where the bank approved the transfer, where $10 million disappeared, where Brian had already moved on to phase 2. Life insurance that would pay double for accidental death. A husband who demonstrated he could forge documents, manipulate systems, erase identities. This wasn't Plan A. This was the version where she survived to discover it. Angie stood, her movements precise, controlled. She looked at Brian, really looked at him, and understood with crystalline clarity. She'd been living with someone who'd been calculating her worth dead versus alive. And she'd come within 45 minutes of never knowing the difference. Brian's lawyer arrived within 20 minutes, a man named Preston Hartley who wore his Harvard education like armor and his retainer fees like a warning. He carried the kind of confidence that came from winning cases that should have been unwinnable, from representing men who'd done inexcusable things and walked away with settlements instead of sentences. My client won't be answering any questions without proper legal counsel present, Preston announced, his voice calibrated for courtrooms and intimidation. Furthermore, I'd like to state for the record that this entire situation appears to be a domestic dispute that's been catastrophically mishandled by banking personnel who failed to recognize the complexity of marital asset management. Detective Sarah Chin looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who'd heard this speech 100 times before. Mr. Hartley, your client presented fraudulent identification, forged documents, and attempted to liquidate $10 million from accounts that don't bear his name using an impersonator. This isn't a domestic dispute. This is wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Federal charges. My client is a respected financial consultant, Preston continued undeterred. He's been married to Mrs. McNeil for 8 years, has joint access to numerous accounts, and was operating under the reasonable belief that he had authorization to manage family assets. Any confusion regarding signatures or identification is clearly the result of miscommunication, not criminal intent. Brian sat straighter, his face arranging itself into something approaching dignity. This was familiar territory, rooms where his education mattered, where his professional credentials carried weight, where being the right kind of man with the right kind of lawyer meant the benefit of doubt tilted in your direction. Detective, Brian said, his voice steadier now, my wife has always been emotional about financial matters. She has control issues that stem from childhood trauma around money. I was simply trying to access our funds for legitimate business purposes. If she's misinterpreting, Stop. Angie's voice cut through the room like a blade. She hadn't moved from her position by the window, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't shown anything resembling emotion. Detective Chun, may I present additional evidence? She handed over her phone. On the screen, text messages between Brian and Lynn dating back 4 months. Plans, timelines, rehearsal schedules. And in one particularly damning exchange, once we have the money cleared, we'll be in the Caymans before she even realizes what happened. Preston's face didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The kind of calculation that happened when a lawyer realized their retainer wasn't worth the prison time. David Cho stepped forward with printed bank records. Mr. McNeil requested wire transfer routing to 3 separate offshore accounts. The paperwork was prepared yesterday. He was very specific about timing and about ensuring Mrs. McNeil wouldn't be notified until after the funds cleared. The detective's expression hardened. Mr. McNeil, stand up, please. Brian's lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that had stopped many arrests before. But Sarah Chen was already reading Miranda rights, her partner already moving with handcuffs that clicked shut with a sound that echoed against marble. Lynn Lowe had been escorted out 10 minutes earlier, still crying, still apologizing, still somehow believing that desperation excused conspiracy. But Brian was being walked through the same lobby where he'd entered that morning believing he was hours from freedom, from money, from a life he'd planned with another woman while sleeping beside his wife. Angie watched it happen from the glass-walled suite. Watched him realize that his education couldn't rewrite evidence. That his lawyer couldn't argue away premeditation. That being a white man with professional credentials didn't grant immunity from federal prosecution. The system he'd assumed would bend for him had held firm. Not because it was just, Angie understood how often it wasn't. But because this time, the evidence was undeniable, the victim was credible, and the crime was too calculated to explain away. Brian looked back at her one last time before they let him outside. His face carried the incomprehension of someone who'd always believed the world worked differently for people like him. Angie stood alone in the private banking suite, surrounded by documents and testimony and the wreckage of 8 years, and felt something unexpected rise in her chest. Not rage, not grief, relief. She was finally free. Mitchell Graham's office smelled like old books and expensive coffee, the kind of space where generational wealth went to protect itself. Angie sat across from him at 9 a.m. the following morning, a stack of documents between them that represented the systematic dismantling of her marriage. All accounts bearing your name have been frozen and password protected, Mitchell said, sliding papers across the mahogany desk. The trust fund is untouchable. Your grandmother's estate planning was airtight. The joint accounts have been severed. I've filed emergency injunctions preventing Brian from accessing any assets, properties, or financial instruments connected to your name or your family's legacy. Angie signed each document with the same measured precision she'd used for 8 years on anniversary cards and mortgage refinancing. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she'd signed away her trust so easily to someone who'd been practicing her signature in secret. The life insurance beneficiary has been restored to your daughters and your mother, Mitchell continued. I've also initiated a full forensic audit of every account Brian had access to. If he moved money before this week, we'll find it. And the criminal charges? Federal prosecutors are building their case. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, forgery. Lynn Lowe is cooperating fully in exchange for reduced charges. Her testimony will be devastating. He paused, studying her face. Brian's lawyer tried to negotiate this morning. Wanted to frame this as a misunderstanding, offer restitution, avoid trial. No. The word came without hesitation. He researched how much my death was worth. There's no restitution for that. Mitchell nodded, unsurprised. The divorce petition will be filed this afternoon. Irreconcilable differences, fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. We're requesting sole custody of your daughters with supervised visitation only after criminal proceedings conclude. Given the circumstances, I expect the court will agree. Angie thought about her daughters, 10 and 12, old enough to understand betrayal, young enough to still believe their father was someone worth defending. That conversation would come later, in therapy offices and careful explanations. But they would understand, eventually, that removing someone from your life wasn't cruelty. Sometimes it was survival. What does Brian understand about all this? Angie asked. Mitchell's expression shifted to something approaching satisfaction. He's in federal custody. His bail was set at $2 million, money he can't access because every account he might have used is frozen or under investigation. His lawyer is explaining that he's looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted on all counts. I don't think he's processed it yet. He keeps insisting this is temporary, that you'll come to your senses. Angie almost smiled. Almost. He still thinks I'm the woman he married. Are you? She considered the question while watching the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. The woman Brian married had believed in rational love, in partnership, in the myth that intelligence protected you from predators. That woman had added his name to bank accounts and trusted him with her legacy because she thought cynicism was the opposite of love rather than its prerequisite. No, Angie said quietly. I'm whoever's left after learning your husband researched how much your death was worth. Mitchell gathered the signed documents, each one a severance, each one a reclamation. For what it's worth, Angie, I've practiced family law for 30 years. I've never seen someone handle something this devastating with this much control. Control is what I have left. She stood, smoothing her suit. Black again, armor again. The documents were filed. The accounts were secured. The marriage was dissolving like it had never existed at all. And somewhere in a federal holding cell, Brian McNeil was finally understanding that he'd never known who his wife truly was. Angie walked out of Mitchell's office into morning sunlight that felt different somehow. Cleaner. Less weighted. She stood on the sidewalk for exactly 10 seconds, feeling the air move through her lungs without the pressure of wondering what was being taken from her while she wasn't watching. For the first time in days, maybe years, Angie breathed. 3 weeks after the phone call that detonated her reality, Angie McNeil stood on the same downtown sidewalk where she'd stood the morning after, and the city looked different. Not structurally. The buildings still reflected October sunlight off glass and steel. The traffic still moved in its familiar choreography of impatience. The lake still stretched toward the horizon with the kind of permanence that made human drama feel temporary. But something fundamental had shifted in how she occupied the space, like she'd been walking through the world slightly out of focus and had finally adjusted the lens. All accounts bearing your name have been frozen and password protected, Mitchell said, sliding papers across the mahogany desk. The trust fund is untouchable. Your grandmother's estate planning was airtight. The joint accounts have been severed. I've filed emergency injunctions preventing Brian from accessing any assets, properties, or financial instruments connected to your name or your family's legacy. Angie signed each document with the same measured precision she'd used for 8 years on anniversary cards and mortgage refinancing. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she'd signed away her trust so easily to someone who'd been practicing her signature in secret. The life insurance beneficiary has been restored to your daughters and your mother, Mitchell continued. I've also initiated a full forensic audit of every account Brian had access to. If he moved money before this week, we'll find it. And the criminal charges? Federal prosecutors are building their case. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, forgery. Lynn Lowe is cooperating fully in exchange for reduced charges. Her testimony will be devastating. He paused, studying her face. Brian's lawyer tried to negotiate this morning. Wanted to frame this as a misunderstanding, offer restitution, avoid trial. No. The word came without hesitation. He researched how much my death was worth. There's no restitution for that. Mitchell nodded, unsurprised. The divorce petition will be filed this afternoon. Irreconcilable differences, fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. We're requesting sole custody of your daughters with supervised visitation only after criminal proceedings conclude. Given the circumstances, I expect the court will agree. Angie thought about her daughters, 10 and 12, old enough to understand betrayal, young enough to still believe their father was someone worth defending. That conversation would come later, in therapy offices and careful explanations. But they would understand, eventually, that removing someone from your life wasn't cruelty. Sometimes it was survival. What does Brian understand about all this? Angie asked. Mitchell's expression shifted to something approaching satisfaction. He's in federal custody. His bail was set at $2 million, money he can't access because every account he might have used is frozen or under investigation. His lawyer is explaining that he's looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted on all counts. I don't think he's processed it yet. He keeps insisting this is temporary, that you'll come to your senses. Angie almost smiled. Almost. He still thinks I'm the woman he married. Are you? She considered the question while watching the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. The woman Brian married had believed in rational love, in partnership, in the myth that intelligence protected you from predators. That woman had added his name to bank accounts and trusted him with her legacy because she thought cynicism was the opposite of love rather than its prerequisite. No, Angie said quietly. I'm whoever's left after learning your husband researched how much your death was worth. Mitchell gathered the signed documents, each one a severance, each one a reclamation. For what it's worth, Angie, I've practiced family law for 30 years. I've never seen someone handle something this devastating with this much control. Control is what I have left. She stood, smoothing her suit. Black again, armor again. The documents were filed. The accounts were secured. The marriage was dissolving like it had never existed at all. And somewhere in a federal holding cell, Brian McNeil was finally understanding that he'd never known who his wife truly was. Angie walked out of Mitchell's office into morning sunlight that felt different somehow. Cleaner. Less weighted. She stood on the sidewalk for exactly 10 seconds, feeling the air move through her lungs without the pressure of wondering what was being taken from her while she wasn't watching. For the first time in days, maybe years, Angie breathed. 3 weeks after the phone call that detonated her reality, Angie McNeil stood on the same downtown sidewalk where she'd stood the morning after, and the city looked different. Not structurally. The buildings still reflected October sunlight off glass and steel. The traffic still moved in its familiar choreography of impatience. The lake still stretched toward the horizon with the kind of permanence that made human drama feel temporary. But something fundamental had shifted in how she occupied the space, like she'd been walking through the world slightly out of focus and had finally adjusted the lens. She carried a single leather portfolio, the kind successful women held when they didn't need briefcases to prove their competence. Inside, updated trust documentation, new insurance policies, passport with travel plans for her daughters over winter break. Evidence of a life being reconstructed on foundations that couldn't be forged or stolen or impersonated. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Trust distributions finalized. Your grandmother would be proud. Angie allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of that. 3 generations of women who'd survived by being strategic, by understanding that protection meant preparation, by knowing that power didn't announce itself with volume. It moved quietly, deliberately, and only revealed itself when necessary. She thought about Lynn Lowe, who'd spent 3 months studying someone else's life because survival demanded it. Who'd learned to walk like Angie, talk like Angie, sign documents like Angie. Who'd gotten so close to becoming her that bank employees couldn't tell the difference. But there was something Lynn couldn't replicate, the bone-deep understanding of what it meant to carry a legacy that predated you, to be the steward of survival that your grandmother clawed into existence. Identity wasn't just appearance. It was memory. It was consequence. It was knowing exactly who you were when someone tried to erase you. Brian was still in federal custody, his bail denied after prosecutors demonstrated flight risk using his own offshore account research. His lawyer had stopped calling Mitchell with negotiation attempts. The criminal trial was scheduled for January. Lynn would testify. The text messages would be entered as evidence. And somewhere in the careful architecture of the federal justice system, Brian McNeil was finally learning that intelligence and privilege weren't the same as preparation. Angie turned toward her car, her heels striking the pavement with the same measured precision they always had. She wasn't a different woman now. She was the same woman, finally visible to herself. The woman who'd built a career protecting other people's legacies while forgetting that her own required equal vigilance. The woman who'd mistaken trust for weakness and control for strength, when really they were just different expressions of the same survival instinct. Her daughters were waiting at home. There would be conversations about what happened, about why their father wasn't there, about how sometimes the people you love most can become strangers. But those conversations would happen in a house that was still theirs, with accounts that still bore their names, with a future that hadn't been liquidated and wired to the Caymans while they slept. Angie started the engine and pulled into traffic, merging seamlessly into the flow of the city that had almost watched her disappear without noticing. She thought about the 11 words that started this. Your husband is here with a woman who looks exactly like you. Brian had believed he was the architect of her erasure, that he'd been clever enough, patient enough, strategic enough to remove her from her own life. That with the right preparation, the right accomplice, the right timing, he could make Angie McNeil vanish and claim everything she'd protected. He'd been wrong. He didn't almost win. He almost vanished.